Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Thanks so much for tuning in today to the Green Bank Network webinar on how green banks assess and report impacts and why it's important. This is Bettina Bergu speaking. I'm from the Natural Resources Defense Council. As a reminder to all the attendees, you're in listen-only mode, so if you have a question, just go ahead and put it into the questions box on your GoToWebinar panel, and I will get to that during the Q&A toward the end of the webinar. Going ahead and diving in, the Green Bank Network was formed in December of 2015 with the aim of fostering collaboration and knowledge exchange among existing green banks, as well as to serve as a source of knowledge for jurisdictions that are considering to establish a green bank. Our 6 members across 5 countries are here on the screen, and the Secretariat is made up of ourselves, the Natural Resource Defense Council, as well as the Coalition for Green Capital. And while we're here, just a quick definition of what a green bank is. Green banks vary in how they're structured, they vary in how they invest, exactly what they do. But at its core, a green bank is a publicly capitalized entity established specifically to facilitate increased private investment into low-carbon, climate-resilient infrastructure, which we also call green infrastructure. And this includes clean energy, including low-emissions vehicles, as well as water and waste management. So today, I'm really excited to have executives from 2 of our member institutions joining me. They are Gavin Templeton, the Head of Sustainable Finance at the Green Investment Group, as well as Caroline Ngorley, the Chief Operating Officer at New York Green Bank. And before turning it over to them to go into a deep dive into their approaches to impact reporting, just a quick overview of a recently released GBN issue brief on this topic, which you can find at the Green Bank Network Knowledge Center there at the URL on the bottom of your screen. The first thing the issue brief looks at is why do green banks report on impacts more broadly than other financial institutions do? And the answer is going back to that definition of what a green bank is. They are hybrid institutions. They are initially funded with public capital and they have a public policy mission, but with the objective of working closely with the private sector to accelerate investment in green infrastructure. So this means they have to be transparent about how they're responsible stewards of public capital, have to be transparent in demonstrating that they're contributing to achieving non-financial policy outcomes, and also transparent with their private sector counterparties that they're performing financially at a level that increases private sector confidence in green investments. Additionally, interestingly, in this moment, we know there are many public as well as private investors that are also looking to understand how they can measure and improve how their portfolios are aligned with climate goals and how to report on that in a transparent way. And the approaches and practices that green banks are using to do so can be instructive to those investors. So definitely timely comments from our presenters today. The issue brief lays out the landscape of metrics that green bank members are using to determine direct impact of their activities. And as you can see on the screen here, there are quite a few of them that you can review in detail if you actually go to the issue brief. And while reduction of carbon dioxide emissions is a way that we talk about that investors can determine the climate friendliness of their portfolios, and this is something that all GBN members are reporting on. You can see there are a lot of other metrics used as well, and Gavin and Caroline are going to mention several of those that their institutions use. So in the issue brief, we categorize all these direct impact metrics into 4 categories. They are investments and pipeline, building industry capacity, energy, and environment. And the one metric that I will note specifically is that since, as I said, green banks are meant to use public capital to spur private investment in green infrastructure markets, they all report on leverage or mobilization ratio of green bank dollars to non-green bank dollars mobilized. So as I mentioned, green banks have been created in different policy contexts, different market contexts, and so have their impact evaluation frameworks that they've developed. So the practices on impact reporting do vary from bank to bank. Nevertheless, in the issue brief, we highlight some key issues that green banks generally do have to deal with in those frameworks, and they include how to get data from investees and partners, and as part of that data collection, balancing accountability to public stakeholders with confidentiality needs of its private sector partners. They have to account for what methodologies to use to analyze that data once it's collected. For example, calculating carbon emissions reductions, which can be done in several ways. How to attribute impact to themselves as an investor versus to other co-investors and counterparties, and this avoids double counting. They have to account for how to assess actual impact realized over the lifetime of projects by monitoring performance, and then as necessary, go back and adjust those results that were forecasted before to what results were actually realized. And then lastly, how to work with third parties to verify data that is to be reported. And Gavin and Caroline, again, will dive a bit deeper into those issues. And since they're not presenting today, I did just want to mention the Connecticut Green Bank, that they have a specific impact page on their website, and that lists a lot of additional resources related to how they assess impact. And specifically, recently they released a fact sheet on how they're now using a model from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to calculate the public health benefits of their investments, which is interesting. And they're using this model from the EPA to assess how investments decrease various emissions that affect air quality, and then through that assess the public health benefits of improved air quality. And then also on their website, you can see this great impact map that's on your screen right now, where you can actually see the impact of individual projects. So the individual projects are these little dots on the map. So if you click on one, you can actually see that project's associated impact in the little box on the left. So a nifty tool to check out. In addition to direct impact, as green banks are maturing, they're starting to think more about how to evaluate their contribution to market transformation. And we define this as the process through which green banks facilitate transactions in which they're not directly involved by pushing enduring and widespread market changes. This type of impact, as compared to direct impact, is harder to measure, and this is because it happens over a relatively long time frame. It requires a baseline to compare the future to, and it's tough to attribute market changes to specific actors when there are many of them, like there are in the clean energy financing sector. But green banks are starting to think about this, how they contribute to market transformation. And so shown here is the Connecticut Green Bank's program logic model. And this shows how the Green Bank sees its activities contributing to transforming the financing market for clean energy in Connecticut. One thing to note about this model that I think is great is that the box labeled number 1 is showing Connecticut Green Bank in the broader landscape of actors driving the state's clean energy financing market. So you can see they have the utility, the state efficiency fund, and some others. And what this recognizes is that all of those actors are working together to increase demand for clean energy and increase the supply of capital for those projects. And what this model is also showing, kind of with the big box and then leading into the societal impacts in box 6, is that as the financing market continues to be transformed and capital supplied and demand growth, it generates ever greater societal benefits like improved public health and job creation. So as green banks mature, this type of thinking about how market transformation happens can contribute to policymakers and everyone else's understanding of how to drive that market transformation and use green banks as well as other tools to decarbonize the economy in an accelerated way. So with that overview of the issue brief, I will now turn it over to Gavin Templeton, the head of sustainable finance at the Green Investment Group, to dive into their practices.
Thanks very much, Bettina. Hello, everyone. Hello from Edinburgh. The sun is shining here, which is not always the case, so I've got a smile on my face. So thanks for tuning in today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we do green at the Green Investment Group. But probably worthwhile going back to the beginning before we start and trying to understand, why did we spend time thinking about how we measure the greenness of our investments? Well, we always had a view right from the very beginning that green investments would be worth more than non-green investments in the future. And at the core of that hypothesis was the ability to be able to measure how green the investments are. There was a very famous Scottish scientist that said sometime many years ago, what gets measured gets managed. And we fully believe in that phrase. So moving on to the next slide. So what I'll do is I'll give you guys a little bit of an introduction. Then I'll talk a little bit about the Green Investment Group itself. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we put our reflections on greenness into practice through our green investment principles, our policy, and our process, which is articulated through our Green Investment Handbook. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the future. So let's move on to the first slide proper. So I think really reflecting what Bettina has said, the Green Investment Bank, as it was then, was set up with particular public policy mission in mind. We had three areas that we were focused on, and these three areas were because the UK government had signed up to legislation. So the UK was actually the first country in the world which had climate change legislation in place. So if you keep rolling forward, Bettina, you can see all the measures that the UK government had signed up to. So hence, that was where we had to focus our expertise in science in terms of what we had to measure. And obviously what we had when we started out is now playing out. If you look at the next slide, this concept and the importance of measurement is what we are starting to see globally. And there is increased interest in how people measure the performance on non-financial metrics, certainly in the context of climate change. And I think that's why we are seeing huge interest, an increase in interest in terms of how we assess the green investments. So if we roll forward again, Bettina. Keep going to the next slide. So the UK Green Investment Bank, as it was back then, was a world first. And there's some statistics that were set up in 2012. When we were eventually privatised, we're now under ownership of Macquarie. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. But when the privatisation took place, we had committed £3.4 billion and mobilised £12 billion in over 100 projects. And that's roughly a £3 of private sector money to £1 of public sector money. Where we are today, those numbers have increased, and we're roughly around 114 projects, and we've now committed something like 4.1 billion and mobilised nearly 18 billion. But absolutely the core of what we did was our mission statement, which was to be green and profitable. So that wasn't green or profitable, and certainly from our perspective, we were not going to compromise on the financial return in order to do something green. So that's what we were set up to do, to show the market that you could get successfully both positive financial returns and good green outcomes. So if you roll on to the next slide. And we were really fortunate at the Green Investment Bank because we could try and we could test out our methodology on every single investment that we made. And that's what we did. And it's been carried out on over £12 billion of infrastructure investment, now £14 billion as it is maintained on under our new ownership. And in terms of the green impact that we've had, and again, this is up until the privatisation, renewable energy generation of over 21.5 terawatt hours, which is enough to power 5.1 million homes, and CO2 avoided, which is greater, of 8 million tonnes, which is enough to take 3.5 million cars off the road. And I sometimes joke about this because we're never sure if this is a good number or not, because we are pretty unique in terms of how we invest, because we're the only investment institution reporting on this basis. But clearly we believe this is going to be something that takes hold and expands in the future. So moving on to the next slide, we are committed to a double bottom line. We are absolutely committed to being green and profitable. So we get our green impact statements in our annual reports assured to the same level that we get our financial reports assured. That's actually been quite entertaining because I think we've been educating the assurance provider as much as they've been educating us. But if you go online, you can find our annual report and you can find our green impact statements and you can find the independent assurance letter in that. And again, that will continue in the future. Moving on to the next slide. We also understand that it's important to have a consistent way of measuring impact. And we've been working with a wide variety of multilateral and bilateral institutions really for about 5 years now about getting a harmonized method for greenhouse gas accounting. And it was published at the Paris COP. And you can find it if you Google IFI Harmonized Approach to Carbon Accounting, which is a bit of a mouthful. But that continues to evolve. It's not a static thing. Now, the calculation for carbon emissions avoided is clearly based on the prevailing standard, which is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Clean Development Mechanism approach. But we are now working with this same group to try and understand if we can get a consistent approach to Paris alignment. So could you create an approach that you could definitively say whether projects were aligned with what is required under the Paris Agreement? So that is definitely a work in progress. So moving on to the next slide. So again, thinking about our own approach, we looked around at the very beginning and we saw a lot of parties looking at carbon footprinting and trying to understand the negative impact of investments. And this really led us to create this concept of a green balance sheet. It's not a true balance sheet, but to us, it probably explains it quite well. You know, no one was trying to articulate the positive response that they were having. No one was trying to articulate the positive response that their investments were having, and that's where we spent our time. We didn't have to repeat a lot of the great work that others were doing, so we spent our time thinking about the asset side of that green balance sheet, and that's what you see in our green impact reports in our annual report. And then moving on again, and I'll come to this in a little bit more detail, our Green Investment Handbook, almost by accident, has become a bit of a market reference. So when we started out, people would ask us, well, how do you do green at the Green Investment Bank? So we decided to publish our process document, and that became our Green Investment Handbook. And it's actually been translated now into Spanish and Mandarin and Arabic, with Portuguese, French, Korean, and Japanese versions already in the pipeline. And that's really an articulation of the process that we go through and that you can go through as investors if you want to do green in the same fashion as the Green Investment Bank. So let's move on, and we can move on to the next slide. Now, we were again quite lucky when we started out. So we were given a definition of green by the UK government. This is in our Articles of Association, and it remains there today. And we were only allowed to invest where we met one or more of these green purposes. So it was up to us to define our methodology and measure the metrics within the context of our green purposes, which you can see there on the screen. So how did we do that in practice? Well, moving on to the next slide, the first thing we did was we developed our green investment principles. And you can see those there on the screen, and you can download the green investment principles from our website. So I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but you can see principle number 1, positive contribution to a recognized green purpose. I mentioned that before. Principle number 2, overall, our portfolio should be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Principle number 3, enduring green impact. What does that mean? Well, we're a commercial investor. We always have been a commercial investor because we didn't want to just give money away. We wanted to invest money because we wanted to be an enduring institution. And the other one I'll pull out in terms of collecting the information is principle number 6. And this is something we introduced into all our investment documents. And this is the concept of green covenants. And these green covenants allow us access to non-financial information on an ongoing basis. And they allow us to report the metrics that we use in our annual report. And those metrics, again, we tried to think about which ones we could collect that would be consistent. So we collect CO2 emissions avoided, we collect renewable energy generated, we collect energy demand reduced, we collect waste to landfill avoided, and we collect recycling as well in terms of our projects, because that covers the investment universe that we have been engaged in to date. I'm expecting that will evolve in future as we start to take on new areas. So just going beyond those principles, we put that into practice. Well, that's the principles are implemented through our green investment policy. Again, you can go online and download that and have a look at that yourself. And then the process in terms of how we do it in practice is described, and the sort of day in, day out process is described in the Green Investment Handbook. Again, you can go online. I think there's probably about 4 languages up there at the moment, but hopefully we'll be adding to those in the very near future. And then moving on again, we decided that for us, it wasn't enough just to be calculating the metrics. We wanted a way to understand the relative greenness. And this is particularly important because we wanted to be able to speak to our investment bankers in a way that they could understand, because they're not all environmental experts. So using the basis of our 5 green purposes, which I touched upon earlier, we developed a rating system which allows us to compare performance on a green basis with all our investments globally. So it takes a combination of data and context and reports that we look at, and it turns it into this deal assessment ratings tool, or dartboard, which appears in every single one of our investment papers. And it's proven to be invaluable for us to be able to talk to investment committees and investment teams about the relative performance across all of our green purposes. Interesting to note, this will be changing, this rating system, as of April this year, when we're expanding it out to be going from AAA to E, because we're starting to move internationally, and we didn't think the scale was sufficient to try and understand the potential for green impact in some of the more emerging economies which have got more coal on the system. And then finally, in this particular section, the final bit actually that we thought about was the concept of green risk, which is on the next slide. And to us, the green risk is really understanding what's the risk of not getting your green impact. Now, why is this important? Well, we imagine, again, thinking ahead for the future. In 10 years' time, regulators, financial regulators, are going to want to know if you are aligned with the Paris Agreement. So for institutional investors, and that will mean measuring what carbon content or lack of carbon content you have on your own green balance sheet. And this concept of green risk allows us to assess whether the likelihood of getting the green impact is 5, or the likelihood of getting the green impact is 1. And again, it's slightly hypothetical at the minute, but it informs us and certainly allows us to be talking about green impact in a way which is much more akin to how we talk about financial performance. And then moving on again. And again, this last bit is really thinking about the future. Now, one thing I would say in terms of under our new ownership, everything that we do will continue, and everything that we do will start to expand. So the Green Investment Group will become a platform for green investment for the Macquarie Group in Asia. It will become a platform for green investment in the Americas, and it will all follow exactly the same process that we have tried and tested on every single one of our investments. And the important thing about that is it has not been anything that we've had to try and convince them to do. They want to do it. It's demand driven because investors are much, much more interested in this. So for all of our investments, you're going to start to see green impact reports appearing when we announce the investment. They will be on completion of the investment. You can see a few examples on our website. And green ratings, that is what we do internally. I spoke about a little bit about that a second ago. And in green advisory services, some people in other countries are interested in potentially setting up green investment banks in a similar fashion to we did in 2012. So we're starting to talk to them about how we do that. So I think on that note, I will hand over. I think it's going to Caroline, who's going to be speaking a little bit about the New York Green Bank.
Great, thank you, Gavin. It's Caroline Anguli here. Thank you, Bettina, and thank you everybody for tuning in this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you happen to be. So our section of this is really to cover off what Bettina foreshadowed and our version in New York State of what Gavin spoke about for the UK Green Investment Group. So moving to the next slide, the agenda for our part of the conversation here is in 4 parts. We're going to start with New York's evolving energy landscape, looking at the key drivers that underlie the state priorities of which New York Green Bank is a part. So you get a sense of New York Green Bank in the context of the state. That then gives rise to goals and targets, which we'll look at the state level, at the Clean Energy Fund level, and also for New York Green Bank. Focusing in then on the New York Green Bank metrics, we're going to talk a little bit about what are they, where did they come from, what do we report and when, and thinking about that temporally for quarterly, annual, ad hoc, and evaluations. And then finally, putting it all together, we're going to be looking at goals, targets, and metrics that underpin the performance tracking by basically mapping our organizational goals to key performance indicators and then to the metrics. So moving to the next slide, and again, starting with New York's evolving energy infrastructure and landscape. So the bottom line is that New York was faced with antiquated and inefficient energy infrastructure. And we think about this whole systemic issue from 2 aspects. One is the system itself, and the other is the environment. When you think about the system, in New York, we've had a traditional hub and spoke energy infrastructure, which really means you've got a large central generating station with a web of high voltage transmission wires stepping down to distribution networks to each of our homes. You've got built-in overcapacity in a system like that is designed to meet the peakiest of peak days here in New York, the hottest of hot days in August when everybody's got their air conditioners running, and that's obviously in the absence of storage historically. And you've got many facilities that are past their anticipated project life. And then in the environment, obviously we've seen that the increasingly extreme weather has shown that the system is very vulnerable and raises resiliency issues. Next slide. On the next slide, also, we show that maintaining the current system, just this one-way central hub and spoke historical system, is expensive. It's been estimated that it takes $30 billion to maintain or replace the existing system over 10 years. And over the past 10 years, that number was $17 billion. And so that $30 billion is an eye-popping number, and all the more so because it does not take into account the upgrades that are needed to really create Grid 2.0. And so what that tells us is $30 billion right off the bat, we know is going to exceed any public purse. And so then the challenge is, how do we change the grid and the energy infrastructure with those limitations? On the next slide, New York's state solution is something called REV, which stands for Reforming the Energy Vision. And the graphic here is just basically showing the REV grid is Grid 2.0. So Governor Cuomo has a comprehensive strategy in the state of New York that flows through really all state policy, all state agencies, and all state initiatives that relate to making the REV grid no longer hub and spoke, having two-way movements of energy and information, incorporating distributed generation assets and storage, having microgrids for islanding capability, obviously building in the future impact of electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure, and all of this is with an emphasis on clean energy. Moving to the next slide, there are 3 main components of REV. So starting at about the 9 o'clock position on the wheel here, you've got one category is public investment in energy efficiency and renewable energy, and what we call leading by example in the state. Moving clockwise around the circle, you've got an area of activity and strategy which relates to reforming state programs. And then finally, you've got groundbreaking regulatory reform, because obviously the sorts of changes that we're talking about making to the markets and the grid require a regulatory underpinning. So New York Green Bank is positioned within the reforming state programs piece of this rev pie, and we are actually part of a $5.3 billion 10-year clean energy fund, which you'll also see just before noon on this pie. And that's administered by our parent organization, which is called NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. On the next slide, so what is New York Green Bank? We are basically a $1 billion state-sponsored investment fund. Again, $1 billion is a piece of the $5.3 billion clean energy fund. We're established and capitalized by an order of the New York State Public Service Commission, and we were actually first announced by Governor Cuomo in his State of the State address in January 2013, and officially opened for business and set up about summer of 2014. So a little bit behind in terms of the life cycle, the UK Green Investment Group. Our mission on the left there is to accelerate clean energy deployment in New York by, very importantly, working in collaboration with the private sector. And why is that important? It goes back to that $30 billion, that what we need to do in the state far exceeds what we could do with public funds, and so we really need to engage the private sector. And then ultimately our goal is to transform financing markets. And so the idea is that if we're going to mobilize private capital and the markets, we need to meet them basically where they live. And so New York Green Bank is consciously structured and operated and with the look and feel like a private sector investment organization. We mobilize greater private sector activity basically to develop clean energy projects that are where we call on the near frontier. So we're not here to compete with existing capital incumbents who are already getting certain types of clean energy projects done. We're really here on the near frontier to put into the mainstream new asset classes and create liquidity in those new asset classes. We operate in the wholesale market, like Gavin had said, for the UK. We must be self-sufficient. We're about financial returns as well, and so we don't offer grants or subsidized capital. And again, it really is about what are the things that we can be investing in today that involve proven technologies, but maybe some different types of models and different types of credits that we can clearly see in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years become mainstream asset classes, where current incumbents will be very interested to increase their exposure to those types of assets. Moving to the next section, talking about what are the goals and targets of the state level Clean Energy Fund and New York Green Bank. Moving on again, at the overarching level, New York State has some very ambitious energy goals for 2030. They're most commonly encapsulated into the 3 goals you see on this page. One is achieving a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 levels by 2030. Secondly, and very relevant also to what New York Green Bank does, it's making sure that 50% of New York State's electricity comes from renewable energy sources by 2030. And finally, on the efficiency front, making sure that there's at least a 23% decrease in energy consumption of buildings from 2012 levels, also by 2030. On the next slide, drilling down, how does the Clean Energy Fund, of which New York Green Bank is a part, and New York Green Bank itself, how do our targets fit into that New York State context? So what's shown on this slide is, on the left-hand side, what some impact benefit targets are, and then on the right-hand side, some key financial targets. So impact benefit targets, if you look at about halfway down the table, there's a line for New York Green Bank, which shows that during the lifetime of the Clean Energy Fund, which runs from the 1st of January 2016 through December 2025, New York Green Bank's target is to have 62 million MWH, for example, of clean energy generated. Moving to the middle of the slide, 29 million tons of GHG emissions. Moving to the right-hand side of the table, and Gavin had touched on this too, that the $1 billion of capital we get at the outset ultimately generates investment, so total project costs in clean energy in the state of $8 million, with a leverage ratio therefore of 8-to-1. Key financial targets involve, as I indicated earlier, that we must be self-sufficient. From the time that New York Green Bank was formed, based on our business planning, we had predicted that we would reach self-sufficiency, so the production of net income for the first time, by the end of our current fiscal year, which ends on the 31st of March. In fact, we reached that target 1 year early, and as we'll see from some of the performance slides later down the presentation, we've also reached and retained cumulative break-even. Bottom right-hand corner of this slide, where we talk about $1.9 billion in investment. So basically the $1 billion that we've been granted by the state of New York, which represents all ratepayer funds, will be invested, will be repaid to us, and will be reinvested, so that by the end of the Clean Energy Fund term, almost $2 billion will actually have been invested by New York Green Bank, tying to almost $6 billion of total project costs and capital from other sources. That gets you to that roughly $8 billion in total by the end of the Clean Energy Fund term. So on to the next slide and the next section, where we're going to be talking about what are the metrics. So the next slide again is giving a little bit of background about where did New York Green Bank's impact metrics come from. And so what you see on this slide are two quotes. The top left is from the initial capitalization order that was made by the Public Service Commission in December 2013. And that was the order that officially established New York Green Bank and granted it its first slug of capitalization, which was roughly $220 million. So as part of that order, there were, as you expect, a number of conditions. And one of those conditions was that NYSERDA was going to work with the Department of Public Service to develop metrics for New York Green Bank, and in particular, focusing on operational performance, risk management, and financial and market metrics. Because of the metrics, I'm sure this has been Gavin's experience also, as we started New York Green Bank, we had an idea of what some of the metrics would be. Obviously, we did that somewhat in a vacuum at the beginning of New York Green Bank's life cycle. As we've gotten more and more experience, we've been able to refine the metrics, and they're very much a living, breathing thing and always evolving. And that's in part recognized by the second longer quote you see on this slide in the bottom left-hand corner, where as part of the Clean Energy Fund order, which was made by the Public Service Commission in January 2016. And the importance of that order to New York Green Bank was that it basically granted us the balance of our capital and locked in the fact that we are indeed a $1 billion capitalized state-sponsored fund. So in that second order, there was a request that New York Green Bank work with stakeholders to review what were then the existing metrics and get stakeholder input on a broad base and revise the metrics. And so currently we're on our metrics 3.0. And as we get further into this presentation, we're going to show you what some of those requirements are. So on the next slide, the metrics plan is available on our website and provides templates for our periodic reporting in a very specific way. These next pages are going to show some key components, and it's going to give you what's required temporally on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis, and divided between financial metrics, other performance metrics, and also then energy and environmental. So on this slide, a lot of information, and again, this is just a template, but you'll see that our quarterly metrics are divided into various categories. So starting at the top, we always talk about capital position, and every quarter we report what was the prior quarter's number by way of comparison and then the current quarter. So for our purposes, authorized capital, authorized administrative expenses, and authorized evaluation expenses have been set in stone for a long, long time, at least since January 2016. So our authorized capital is $1 billion. Our authorized administrative expenses were over $17 million, which was basically approved startup runway costs that were permitted by the PSC, and then costs for evaluation of $4 million. So those don't actually change month to month. The next section, we look at operational matters and operational/financial. Here we report what our cumulative revenues are, what our cumulative operating expenses are, so you can see our cumulative break even and you can work out what our net income is basically on a quarterly basis. Our operating expenses are further divided into what's direct and what's allocated overhead. And then there are some lines here for a credit facility, which is a facility that we're able to access if at some point in the future New York Green Bank requires liquidity that is not available from the funding of the Clean Energy Fund in the time that we actually need the additional funds. So while we, as New York Green Bank, have been allocated the $1 billion, there is a schedule of how that money comes to us. And everybody recognized at the outset that if the demand for New York Green Bank investment were to outstrip that initial funding schedule, nobody wanted, liquidity risk to basically stop the good work of New York Green Bank. And so it was recognized that a credit facility could be put in place to provide that liquidity. In the bottom third of the slide, we have our metrics that relate to our investment portfolio. We talk about in the third line our current portfolio, which is basically what do we have committed at the moment. And the current portfolio is a combination of monies that have been committed but not yet funded, so we call those committed funds, and then money that's out the door that are deployed funds. And often there's a difference between those two numbers, committed and deployed, because in some cases we're giving credit enhancement products which ultimately may never be drawn, even though they are committed. There are many projects that we provide investments into which involve warehouses where our clients are basically developing a pipeline of projects and implementing those projects and making draws against our investment in a way that matches their cash need. And so you see the funds going out over time. And as that happens, obviously funds that are committed to that type of facility, that number goes down and the deployed number goes up. These numbers also fluctuate because we are, as I said before, not a grant or subsidy organization. We're making investments that get repaid. And so funds also flow back in and allow us to redeploy those monies into other clean energy investments in the state, bringing more bang to the buck for each dollar of New York ratepayer money. Overall investments to date basically captures every single dollar of investment that we've made. And we also track for mobilization purposes, what are the total project costs of all the investments that we're involved in, so that we can calculate what $1 of New York Green Bank investment has mobilized in terms of total clean energy projects in the state of New York. The bottom of this slide, and then flipping over to the top of the next slide, we've got some general statistics about what's in our investment portfolio. On the next slide, with number and type of our investments, the type of counterparties, just some general stats so that people can see the sorts of deals we're doing, the distribution between renewable energy and energy efficiency, for example, and the sorts of counterparties we have. From the middle of this slide to the middle of the next slide, which we'll get to shortly, these are all our energy and environmental benefits and metrics that we report upon. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but just to give you a sense of what they cover. They're all, important to note, they're all based on estimates. And so when we at New York Green Bank close a particular transaction, we have a high and a low estimate of expected energy and environmental benefits that are going to come from that project through its life. And so we look at these estimates on a gross lifetime basis, and we also look at them on a first-year basis. And first year doesn't mean the first year of a facility or an investment. It means the first year following the end of an availability period when all the funds have been deployed, the project's been implemented, and it's the first year that that project is generating its energy and environmental benefits. So as you go over the page, you'll also see a number of the metrics relate specifically to CHP, so combined heat and power. And we're looking always at, how much clean energy in terms of capacity, so megawatts are installed, how much clean energy in terms of MWH is generated. If we're talking about energy efficiency, we're very focused on how many MWH may have been saved by this energy efficiency initiative, and equally MMBTU, what is the equivalent in natural gas heating value savings that these energy efficiency projects are achieving. So going down to almost the middle of this slide, a bottom line and a shorthand for us as we talk about our metrics, and Bettina mentioned it in her introduction, is talking about GHG emissions reductions. And again, across our portfolio, every quarter we report all of these metrics, including what the GHG reductions look like. Then rounding out this page, we always report on our active pipeline, which tells us basically, adding to the investments that we've already made, what are the transactions that are already in the pipeline where we're moving, making good progress to move through our whole investment process and close other investments. And similarly, investment process down the bottom, this outlines, and we'll see this in graphical representation in a few slides, what proposals have we received by value, what's the value of approvals that have gone through our scoring committee process, through our green light committee, and then finally through our credit committee, which is called our IRC. On the next page, we also do reporting of annual actual energy and environmental metrics. We do this every calendar year, and this annual actuals or annual installed is reported with our December quarterly filing. So that always shows up in February relating to the calendar year prior. And again, given what we've just gone through, very similar, but it is marrying up on a quarter-by-quarter basis. We're telling you high and low estimates for energy and environmental metrics, and then on an annual basis, we're telling you as our portfolio matures, what in all of these same categories, MWH, MW, MMBTU, savings generated, depending on whether it's energy efficiency or clean energy. And as I say, that happens once a year. On the next slide, we also annually have an annual financial metrics filing. And that happens with our annual audited financial statements, and those form an annex to the annual filing. And in the annual financial filing, it's a shorter filing in general than our quarterly, but it focuses on exactly the metrics that you see here. In addition to the audited financials, we talk about impairment, if there is any. We talk about return on investment, and we talk about that return on investment, on an annual basis, on a cumulative basis, on a gross and net basis. And the important thing to notice here is that when we defined our metrics, the ROI is not actually the industry, accepted ROI. It's really the return on the public's investment. And so that ROI is more like a return on equity. And I think as we go forward, in keeping with what I said earlier, that our metrics are definitely an evolving thing as we get more experience and grow. I think that we will be looking to add some additional metrics, more of the standard investment expectation around ROE and ROI. Final line on this slide is capital redeployment cycle time. This is very important because it tells us how long does it take a dollar of New York Green Bank money to revolve through one clean energy investment and into another. And so obviously it is tied to our mobilization, that 8-to-1 at the project level. Next slide. Final thing that our metrics plan requires us to do is two things. One is to file a transaction profile every time we make an investment. And so a transaction profile is publicly posted on our website broadly within a month to 6 weeks after we close a transaction. And it's a standard profile which basically says what was the transaction, who were the key parties, what type of investment is being made by New York Green Bank. Very importantly, given our mission, what type of market objectives and barriers are being addressed by this transaction. So again, we're at the near frontier, not competing with existing transactions that are already getting done in the marketplace. So what is it that puts this transaction on the near frontier and means that New York Green Bank's involvement was necessary to make this investment happen? It includes the estimated energy and environmental benefits that we've just discussed. It talks, to Gavin's point earlier about, importantly getting information from our counterparties. So what's the plan for collecting the data that's going to back up the estimated energy and environmental benefits and also the installed benefits? And then talking about on a deal-by-deal basis, the method and the outcome of impact evaluation. So then moving to the right-hand side of the slide, the final thing that the metrics plan talks about is independent evaluation. And this is a really important piece of metrics in general. So our independent evaluations are going to fall into three buckets. One relates to impact, in other words, having independent validation of our energy and environmental performance. The second one relates to market transformation, which, as Bettina said, is really at the forefront and a growing area. I think where folks like UKGIB and GIG and New York Green Bank are leading the way, because you do have to say what was happening in the marketplace before this particular entity was active. And now that we've participated in 4 or 5 transactions, are we needed in this marketplace anymore? Has an asset class been created? Are there more private capital participants flocking into this area, needing less and less support and assurance from the participation of a green bank? And then finally, process. And that is basically having independent evaluators look at what is the New York Green Bank investment process, what is the experience of New York Green Bank's clients in working with it, given our objective to look and feel like a private equity fund, essentially. Are we succeeding? And these independent evaluations are commencing for us in 2018. So we're very busy, in fact, right at this moment, coming up with our detailed evaluation plans and picking our independent evaluators. So finally, moving on to the next section, goals, targets, and metrics, bringing this all together, and how does this underpin our performance tracking? So on the next slide, what we've tried to do is, and what we try to do every year, because this is actually an excerpt from our annual business plan, is we try to map what are New York Green Bank's goals writ large. And on the left-hand side of the slide, you see them fall into 3 main buckets. One is attracting capital to clean energy markets, financing markets in New York State. The second is to be self-sufficient. And the third is to deliver energy and environmental impact benefits. So from those very high level and critical goals, we then identify what are the key performance indicators. So what are the things that, you know, if people could see what those were, would tell them that we're either on our way to achieving our goals, or maybe there are some hiccups and some bumps in the road. So the key performance indicators are basically the things that are going to give an indication of how we're trending towards meeting our goals. And then the final aspect of the mapping on the right-hand side of this slide is about what metrics. So what are the metrics that we've just gone through, quarterly, annual, estimated, actual on the impact side? What is it that feeds into each of these key performance indicators? So on this slide, and flipping over to the next slide, which is a continuation of the energy and environmental benefits, this mapping is really to help all of our stakeholders be able to see very clearly how is Green Bank doing with these, dollars of ratepayer capital with which we've been entrusted, and are we meeting the goals which we've set out for ourselves? On the next slide, now I'll go through this section quickly. This is just pulling together what we had reported as of December 31. And so this just gives you an idea of the framework that we've talked about. How does it actually show up in public reporting? And so here, every quarter we report on these bubbles of how much investment we're stimulating in the state, how strong our active pipeline is, mobilizing capital, how many metric tons of GHGs, and how many cars off the road that represents. The next slide, again, just running through these quickly because you'll be able to see this on our quarterly metrics on our website. We try to give an indication of where we are in progressing towards our targets with the term of the CEF, how much money we've invested so far, and how we're going with our GHG reductions. The next slide gives you an example over time since we started keeping these records of how our pipeline is growing, how investments are progressing through our investment process, and then how our portfolio is growing. The next slide is our investment portfolio in terms of dollars that we've committed and deployed, that distinction that I mentioned earlier, that's going to ebb and flow as monies come back to us and are reinvested, but in general trending upwards. The next slide deals with how we then talk about these estimates of low and high of GHG reductions and shows you how those are trending over time. And then the final two slides, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, it shows you our revenues and expenses on both a quarterly basis on this slide, and then on the next slide on a cumulative basis, showing you, as I'd indicated earlier, that we've reached cumulative break even and are in fact solidifying that position. That's it. Back to you, Bettina.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you, Gavin, for those presentations. Wow, I learned a lot myself. This is such a dynamic area of work, so I just thank you for those presentations. And I know that we have mentioned a few different documents, well, lots of different documents, but some key ones are listed actually in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar dashboard. So you can find there a download link to the GBN issue brief on the topic, as well as the English Green Investment Handbook and the latest New York Green Bank quarterly report. And wow, Gavin, I guess if someone needs the handbook in a different language, then they can get that on the website in, I think, 8 languages pretty soon. So that's really.
I think we've got 4 up there, and there'll be another 4 arriving in the next 2 to 3 months.
Awesome, really cool. And you heard it here first: green balance sheet. So I'm sure we'll all be using that term very soon. So let's see, I'm glad that we have some time for questions, just a little bit, but I do want to note before asking a couple of those that the recording of this webinar is going to be posted on the Green Bank Network website. We also have recordings of other webinars, and on the GBN website you can sign up for our newsletter, which also has invitations to upcoming webinars. And here are each of our Twitter links. So let's see, going to a couple questions here. Gavin, I have one for you. You spoke quite a bit about your green impact reports, and someone's wondering, aside from those types of impacts that are listed for individual projects and their green impacts, can you speak at all about what types of impacts GIG has seen in the broader UK infrastructure market? Any market in particular that you've seen some sort of transformation in?
Yeah, thanks, Bettina. I mean, I think the most obvious one and the clear example of the influence that the GIB has had is in the UK offshore wind market. And I guess, talking a little bit about what happens, well, the UK obviously has got a huge offshore wind resource, and back in 2012 it was clear that there weren't enough investors partaking in that, and particularly for utilities who were tying up their balance sheet investing in these projects, which are often like $1 billion plus in terms of putting one of these things up. So we got involved in the market. We started taking positions in operational assets. We moved into construction assets, and actually we're now in developing assets. And the best demonstration of the effect that we've had, and we're the largest investor, I think we are involved in something like 60% of the transactions. We're the largest financial investor in that market. And the cost of energy has dropped by a half, in effect, in the last 5 years. So that's something, we can actually see demonstrable evidence of the intervention that we've had and how we have got the private sector comfortable to be investing in that market, and the cost of energy and actually the cost of capital coming down severely.
Thank you, Gavin. All right, and I think we might just have time for one more, but this is actually one I think I can ask to both Gavin and Caroline, depending on who wants to answer. And the question is, if you use realized impacts that you're tracking through performance monitoring to inform ongoing activities, for example, to see which types of investments are most impactful and feeding that into your investment process.
Sure, it's Caroline. Let me take a quick shot and then I'll hand it over to Gavin. So one thing that I didn't really underscore during the presentation is that New York Green Bank is, very different from a number of other state initiatives in that we're entirely market focused and market responsive. And so we're here to do whatever clean energy investment comes through our doors that fits within our universe. Within that, we definitely manage our overall portfolio to make sure that we're meeting our targets and goals. But we're not yet at a point where we're saying, we're turning this type of project away because we need to do energy efficiency because it's going to deliver more green benefits. I think there's still, so much robust and healthy interest in the New York marketplace that, we're able to meet the market demand and manage the targets across our portfolio, without having to skew what the market demand is.
Yeah, I think I would echo that as well. What Caroline has said. Certainly we have a very strong vision that green performance and green impact will be driving markets in future. But we're not there now, and I think from our perspective, we're not short of capital to invest. So we've never been presented with two equally attractive financial returns and had to choose between which one was the greener. But I think the work that we are doing will absolutely inform that decision making in the future, but it's still some way to go.
Great, thank you to you both. Well, I can't help myself, so I'm just going to do one more, and because this is such an interesting time to talk to both of you. Both of you have mentioned that you're actually in a time of expansion. The GIG is looking into emerging markets, and New York Green Bank is also entering a period of expansion outside of New York. And you mentioned that your metrics are constantly evolving, so maybe if Gavin, you could mention a bit more on how your green ratings are changing as you move into emerging markets, if you have any more specifics on that. And then similarly, Caroline, as New York Green Bank moves into this national expansion, how is that expected to affect your approach to impact assessment and reporting?
Mm-hmm. So from our perspective, I mentioned briefly that we've actually expanded the range of ratings that we assess over a wider range to be able to articulate in different gradients. If you're doing a wind project where there's a large amount of coal on the grid, that has got a different effect than if you're doing a wind project, there's a large amount of hydro on the grid. So we wanted to be able to articulate that. But I think because we were very fortunate to be doing everything in an investment environment in the UK, we haven't had to make any changes. We haven't had to take a fundamental rethink about how we rate any of our projects internally. And we've started to look at projects in India and Africa and Asia already. And the process works. And I think that's why we think it's so powerful. That's that sort of thing that's transferable. And hopefully that will allow us to be able to articulate relative green performance across our entire portfolio. And going back to the previous question, that may well inform institutional investor behaviour, and that's certainly something that we think is coming in years to come.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think there's an expectation that if you're dealing with entities that have their genesis within the state, that the reporting activities and requirements will inherently be sort of bureaucratic and just fit for that purpose and for nothing else. I think what's super interesting about green banks is that the reporting that we're doing, whether it's meeting, originally the UK's policy objectives, in our case, New York State's policy objectives, we're at the cutting edge of quantifying in a way that's tied to financial viability and sustainability, things that the private sector is also grappling with. And so I don't think there's any aspect of the reporting that we do that people would just say, oh, you're expanding and you're raising private capital to expand. And so, a lot of this reporting work that you do for New York is going to be different or not required. I actually think what we're all doing is at the cutting edge of, whether you're in the public or the private sector. And I anticipate that, as we expand, we will still remain as focused on delivering outcomes to New York State, as we have been to date. So that's not going to change. And I think the sorts of things that may change are that we would supplement our metrics with some of the private sector evolutions that are currently happening. And we're working with a number of private sector parties as to standardization, like Gavin was speaking about. And so I see it as a supplementation, not as a total rewriting or replacement.
Mm-hmm. Well, that'll be really interesting to follow how all of that evolves. I'll certainly look forward to keeping up to date on that. And with that, I think we are out of time, but I just want to thank you, Gavin and Caroline, again so much for sharing all this information with us. Thank you to everybody who joined, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.